United States will surge again. Economic power equation has changed. And we're going to be more intertwined with the United States. The stats are starting to show up. A funny thing, when you looked around Australian universities, we were replete with magnificent Asian studies centres and centres focused on particular countries or sub-regions within Asia. And we have in this country a really major level of expertise on the area around us. It's one of the things that makes us a very worthwhile ally for anyone who thinks that they've got serious interests in this area. But one thing we did not have was anything devoted or any centre devoted to the study of our principal ally. And given that Americans think so differently from us, given that their social structure is so different from ours, given that the ideological underpinnings of their politics are so different from ours, not to understand that and the forces involved in all those cultural and philosophical dissimilarities, the forces involved in that in determining the way in which the United States thinks about the world, is for an ally who very firmly understands that our national security is deeply bound up with the United States. It is a glaring chasm in the development of our public policy. So establishing the centre has been very important, and wonderful too that an outreach for that centre has been established here in Western Australia, and the focus of that outreach is the interaction between the relationship we have with the United States and the region around us. There's no more appropriate place in Australia to do that study from than here in Western Australia. A very good development, and Stephen had a lot to do with that, and he should be praised and thanked for that too. I want to thank Stephen again for the job he gave me. What a privilege it's been these last 4 years to witness a transition point in US history, to be the person principally responsible for reporting what is happening in the United States of the first Afro-American president. And he's more than just that. There'll be other Afro-American presidents of the United States, but I'll bet you this, there'll never be an Afro-American president or any other of the United States who speaks fluent Bahasa Indonesia. And I think too, you can say that this is genuinely, Barack Obama is genuinely the first post-Cold War president of the United States. No part of his public life has been conducted during the Cold War. His studies prior to his engagement with electoral politics in the 1990s also had nothing to do with international politics. He was a legal scholar. So he arrived in the position free of any of the paradigms established in his mind that you could expect to see put there by the Cold War. It's made him a very interesting person to observe and to try to discern the way in which he's thinking. I always say to my American friends that we do like you, we love your culture, we enjoy having you around, we're grateful for the support we've had since World War II, but you are our polar opposites. The average American is a person who is optimistic and idealistic. The average Australian is pessimistic and realistic. It is a completely different mindset. It produces completely different attitudes to government. I remember I was at a couple of years ago at the prayer breakfast, which is held in Washington every year and is attended by some 3,000 people, and invariably the president attends this function. And I was sitting next to the Israeli ambassador, and it was in the immediate aftermath of the Arab Spring and a set of developments occurring about which the Israelis were not enthusiastic. And the response to those events in the West, which was enthusiastic, a worry for the Israelis. Anyway, I don't know what it had to do with the Christian religion, nothing at all, but they had Mel Gibson up there as Braveheart. in this gathering, which was supposed to be for the prayerful consideration of the need for non-violence in the globe. And he was there with a sort of white and blue face, very long shaggy hair, his imitation of a Scottish accent, waving a broadsword, and he was making his famous speech, "Give me freedom or give me death," which William the Wallace is supposed to have made at some point. But in the inebriated state in which they fought conflict at that point of time, the notion that he was coherent is a very, very tall historical leap indeed. But nevertheless, that is what he said, and the Israeli ambassador turned to me ruefully and he said, "Kim, damn it, freedom is hardwired in these Americans." Which is interesting, an interesting perspective, because what he, and I guess most of the rest of the world looks at when we look at international diplomacy, we look for nuance. We look for the possibilities of going around the flanks to try to get through negotiated solutions. We try not to impose too much of the way in which we think about the world on what the outcome is likely to be. It's sufficient alone to get through this challenge with as many people alive as you can and in a reasonably prosperous state. That, I guess, is how we tend to look at the world a bit, insofar as from our small posse we are able to influence it. That is not the way the Americans look at the world at all. They may get back to that point, but they sure have a circuitous route to get there. When something like what is going on in the Ukraine is happening, something like what's going on in Syria or Egypt, there is an automatic response amongst a large number of very convicted Americans. We've got to do something about this. The world expects us to do something about this. The world, in fact, will often tell the Americans that that is exactly what they expect. And when the Americans do something about it, find in what ways they can put most distance between them and the United States and eat their political capital instead of having to spend some of their own on getting a solution. Well, Obama's got news for them. Obama is the sort of president who thinks that he's not the only president in political capital spending game. And he expects, both within the United States and without, that when a serious problem has been identified, there are going to be other people, and not just him, who are going to work their way through to a solution there. That leads a lot of criticism of him from time to time in the American Congress in particular, and more broadly in that enormously broad and diverse American think tank community, scholars of international relations in the United States who are so ubiquitous. I think we've got about 2 or 3 private think tanks here in Australia, and there are 384 in Washington alone. There's nothing the Americans like more to do than think and speak, and they've got plenty of opportunities for themselves to organise all of this. Obama understands that he's inheriting a world that is very different from that of any of his predecessors, and he's not sure what that means. And he approached it in the first instance in that spirit of optimism that is a national characteristic and not just simply his own. And one can't help feel that he's been deeply disappointed. That when he's gone out there, offered an open hand to Iranians, offered an open hand to the broader political Islamic community, offered good offices and hope to people worried about the Israeli-Palestinian discord and its continuing capacity to destabilise global politics, offer an opportunity for a friendly diplomacy with China, with the countries of the area. It must be so saddening to him that much of what he does and much of what he's done tends to be spurned, nuanced, undermined, criticised. It's for a fellow of a cerebral character, an essentially optimistic personality, this must have been for him quite a harsh learning experience. But he's responding to it, and there is structure emerging now in American foreign policy, and I'll talk a little bit about that a bit later on. Now I've got to go on, according to the lecture topic, to the Australian side. I was taken by surprise when I became foreign minister. Not foreign minister, I would have been even more surprised at that. But, and Steve would have been very surprised. But when I became ambassador, I had in my mind an experience, particularly during the Cold War, of being a Minister for Defence and a long-standing student of the United States. And I thought I was pretty current. I was not current at all. Not at all. We were intensely engaged with the US back in the days when I was Defence Minister, very importantly and substantially engaged across the board in intelligence and defence terms. But I had no idea how deeper the relation had become during the course of the 1990s, how more deeply embedded we were, both technologically and in personnel terms, in the United States intelligence system. It's not just the US's intelligence system, more broadly, but how important our contribution was in all of that. How deeply embedded we were in the United States Armed Forces, including the command arrangements. I think the Deputy Commander, for example, of the main army units now in the operating out of PACOM in Hawaii, Deputy Commander is an Australian General. And there's a lot of equivalent positions dotted through both PACOM and one or two others of the American command arrangements. Australian and American militaries are far more intertwined now. Australian and American intelligence services far more intertwined now than was the case when I was Defence Minister in the 1980s. That's the first surprise. The second surprise I'd got was I was not in any way, shape or form used to thinking about the relationship with the United States in an economic context. Like all Australians, we have sort of been self-propagandised on the trade statistics. And we look to the extraordinary good trading opportunities we've established with East Asia, China in particular, Korea, Japan, burgeoning trade, India and Indonesia. That is a focus, but a one-dimensional focus for us. But it's the one that we're traditionally used to. Traded goods, that's how you think about the international economy. It's important, but not that important. Trade is conducted where somebody feels a need and he's obtaining what he needs at a price that he is prepared to pay. When he no longer needs the product or he can no longer afford it, the trade does not take place. Simple as that. Investment is forever. Well, not strictly forever. But if you're betting on someone, you're not just selling him a widget, you're investing in him. And when we take a look now at the investment figures, an extraordinary picture is emerging, and that is of the integration of the Australian and American economies. The United States invests directly and indirectly in Australia $630 billion, which is 10 times what it invests in China. We invest directly and indirectly in the United States $430 billion, which is 20 times what we invest in China. And if that's not enough of a statistic to conjure with, try another one. When I first went to the US 4 years ago, I used to say proudly, we have the fourth largest sum under management in the globe. That's called punching above your weight. We don't have the fourth largest economy. We have the fourth largest sum of money under management in the globe. I now say, courtesy of the Foreign Minister's last speech in the United States, we have the third largest sum of money under management in the globe, $1.9 trillion. Another 12 years, that will be close to about $5 or $6 trillion as we move up the pecking order. Where is that money going to be? Well, let me tell you, it's going to be in the US. And we're going to be more intertwined with the United States than we are now. Australian capitalism, when it bets overseas, bets where it's secure and where it can be suitably turned into a reliable set of earnings. And that is the United States. The interesting thing over the last 3 years, despite the statistics you see associated with ConocoPhillips and Chevron's multi-billion-dollar investments in the north of Western Australia and over in Queensland. Despite that entering the stats that I've been talking about over the last 3 years, for the last 3 years, the amount of new investment in the United States from Australia, compared with new investment in Australia from the United States, the Australian to US figure has exceeded in new investment the money coming into Australia. Now some 10,000 Australian businesses operate in the United States. Some of them are very big. For example, Lend-Lease, which I think the Americans think of as an American company given its title, but it is in fact Australian, does all the defence housing in the United States. That's not a small amount of activity. BHP Billiton is the third biggest driller in the Mexican Gulf. When I went down there to see the chap who is the CEO of BHP Energy, which is not headquartered in Australia, it's headquartered in Houston, in Texas. It was during the period of time of that BP oil spill that you'll probably remember, and I asked him how he was going. He said, well, I spent a lot of my time telling folks there is an H between the B and the P. And and then you've got the Lowies, Westfields, the second biggest shopping centre owner in the United States. You've got the Macquarie Bank, the largest participant in public-private partnerships in the United States. Boral, the biggest US brick producer. Well, those are the sort of standard-bearer outfits that you think about, but the most important elements of them are in fact not those big infrastructure operations, but really high-tech biosciences, high-tech electronics, fibre optics, nanotechnologies. And the reason for that is this, that the United States generates nearly 80% of global venture capital. And if you want to get your product going, and you've invented something brilliant or you've acquired from CSIRO a patent over one of their many inventions, what do? What you do is get yourself to the US. Get up at least an outlet there, because that is going to give you a globally competitive market base, or you actually shift the operation over there. And Australians have loads of great ideas. We want another area where we punch above our weight. The number 13 should always feature as punching above weight stats, because we're the 13th largest economy in the world. So anything where we sort of fall out at 18 or 19, we're punching below our weight. When we turn up above 13, we're punching above it. China is the biggest trading partner, or second biggest, of 120 countries on Earth. The United States is the biggest research partner of every country on Earth. And so the US-France collaboration on research exceeds the French with the Germans or anybody else, and so on. You can work your way around the globe on that. In our case, we are the 8th biggest research partner with the United States. We're punching above our weight by a factor of about 2 when it comes to that. There's an awful lot of complaint around the globe over the theft of intellectual property, and a finger pointed at the cyber espionage in China, Russia, Iran, a number of other places. And it's a worry. It's a thing that really has the focus of the American electorate, troubles them. But I think there's a statistic that I'm aware of that ought to be more troubling to the Chinese than that one to them, and that is this. Of the kids who come to the US, not to do engineering degrees or business degrees or whatever, they do go home. The kids who come to the US to do a PhD in the research sciences, 90% of the students from India and from China, 5 years after graduation, are still in the United States. And why is that important? That's when they marry. And when they marry, what decision do they take? The decision they take is to stay in the United States. So basically, that Statue of Liberty up there could have an extra couple of slogans added to it. Send me your really brilliant people. And we will accommodate them forever. The United States is going through a manufacturing renaissance. It's not a job-producing renaissance of much description, because it's based on technologies which effectively require few but highly skilled people. But what it generates in the service industries around it is enormous. The American capitalism is going through the process of reinventing itself, and that reinvention process will be largely complete within the next 5 to 10 years. Accident, global conflicts and other things perhaps getting in the way, hopefully not, probably not. But short of that, the United States will surge again. The picture of transnational capitalism is changing too. 1970s phenomena is what created the transnational enterprises of such ill fame in domestic debate in wealthy countries like ours, and of such worry in a lot of the countries in which they find them operating. Well, it's a thing of the past. This is going to change substantially over the course of the next 10 years, because one thing new technology industries have discovered is, whereas previously all you needed was your laboratory at home and production could take place a couple of thousand miles away, product now changes so fast that your production engineers and your labs have to be close together. So guess what? Capitalism's going home. These things are only anecdotal now, but these are the changes that are being made. And who is at the epicentre of all of this? Well, it's the United States. And so we now find ourselves, courtesy of the superannuation arrangements that we put in place in the 1980s, courtesy of the free trade agreement that we signed with the United States 8 or 9 years ago, which is now operational, and its most important parts were in the facilitation of investment between the two countries. Courtesy of that, we are becoming, with the United States, in many ways, a singular economy. That is the dominant feature of Australia's global economic presentation, and and conjures up completely different views, completely different assessments from that which you normally see in Australian political debate. Not that our connections with Asia aren't useful. One of the reasons why the Americans are so fascinated with us now is the connection that we have with Asia. And when they give to Americans these sorts of stats, that the second biggest language after English spoken in the Australian household is Mandarin. And if you take a look at the new immigrants to Australia, the biggest language coming in, apart from English, is Hindi. There's an understanding that if you're going to reach out with your product into the region, there might be a bit of expertise there in Australia that you ought to tap into. We are looking so much more important to the US. And that leads me to the third thing I want to talk about in this changing character of the relationship, so different from what it was when I was a Minister for Defence back in the 80s. And that is the significance of the region in which we inhabit. I once had this appalling knockdown, drag-out fight with Cap Weinberger. I was about to produce the 1987 Defence White Paper. In it, I was arguing that Australian defence planning forward would be structured around a concept of self-reliance, that we would wish to be able to militarily dominate our approaches, and that was the most important thing that we should do, our force structure. The kit that we ought to buy ought to be directly related to that. Weinberger's response was, listen, we're trying to operate a global deterrence system here. We're not actually looking for allies who will wander off trying to work out how to defend themselves. We want a contribution. And we had a long discussion about how an effective Australia would help the Western Alliance. But at the end of the day, he said, look, you fellas just go and do what you please, so long as you keep those joint facilities going and so long as you keep that technical collaboration that you have with us, nothing else matters all that much. And it was really interesting. Why? And it suddenly struck me like a silver bullet. They're going to let us get away with anything. We can get over there, we can advocate chemical weapons controls, we can advocate South Pacific nuclear-free zones, we can set up the ideas of APEC, we can do a completely different approach to dealing with problems in Cambodia, the Americans. And at the end of the day, even though we annoy them, they don't care, provided we do the things that sustain our end of the central balance between the Soviet Union and the United States. That's what matters. Why should this liberal view apply to Australia? Well, Southeast Asia didn't matter. After the Nixon Doctrine, the United States rationalised the future planning of their own force structure around the flashpoints of the Cold War, North Asia, Europe, maybe the Middle East. Everything else, Nixon said, our friends and allies in those areas, and they are good friends and allies, ought to look in the first instance to their own defence. So while the Weinberger said, well, you're just doing what the Nixon Doctrine said anyway, so why should I fuss? That was then. Now, we have been transformed. We haven't left the geography that we had before, but whereas we were the Cold War backwater, now we are the southern tier of the focal point of global politics. Courtesy of the changes in the global economy, Asia-Pacific is the centre, and we are co-located on its southern tier, with a reach on the basis of sort of daily discourse into the main time zones of that of the focal point of global politics. So from being essentially a backwater, we are now crucial. The Americans are treating that as crucial. So when President Obama started talking about a pivot, subsequently changing language to rebalance, he was dealing in Australia to the heart of American politics. And much of my time over the last 4 years, and I can see I'm, as usual, beginning to go over time, but much of my time over the last few years has been us advocating one set of perspectives on that to the United States, falling on fallow ground while we do, nuanced in many important ways from precisely the way they see things, but nevertheless on the same page when it comes to a discussion of where the US wants to be. When Obama and Clinton made those statements about a few years ago about doing this, it set so many hairs running through Europe and the Middle East, who have been used to being the focal point of American attention really since World War II. Enormous anxiety, enormous quizzicalness, if you like, about what the meaning of all that is. Generally speaking, the sorts of things that Obama and the Americans have been talking about completely misunderstood by them. It wasn't saying that they were irrelevant. They were just saying that if you have to have a focal point, it's going to be this. It's not going to say that you're going to ignore other things. But it does have an impact because there are a whole variety of factors involved in the United States recognising that there are limits on their power. And one of the factors that emerges from that is a determination by the Americans. When people have good ideas for things they might do, the Americans are going to come back and have very good ideas for what you might do if you want to pursue the same objectives. Clinton, as Secretary of State, built some magnificent building blocks, put them in place in the character of relations with American relations, bilateral relations with other countries in the region around us. The blocks have been put in place. Kerry is now the Secretary of State, of course, and he's often blamed or argued that he's not focusing on the main game, being the Asia-Pacific. It's quite wrong. He is. He's been to the region, he's talked within the region for a number of visits, exactly the same as the number that had been put in place by Hillary Clinton. But he's dealing with other problems, and the rhetoric is around those problems. If I have one complaint in terms of the presentation of American foreign policy at the moment, my complaint is that they are not yet finding a way to mix the messages about what they're up to in the Middle East with what they're up to in Asia. I've gone into the State Department so many times, so many different levels, to try and very helpfully put this point of view forward. And what they're doing is they want to get a situation where non-proliferation objective is achieved in regard to the Iranians. They want a situation where they can sensibly exit Afghanistan. They want a position in place where somehow or other some form of agreement is achieved in Syria and so on. They want a lot of things, but they're also very determined that the folk there will play a role, but the role that they are playing is a role which is interesting to the rest of the globe, but absolutely critical in Asia. And this is what I say to them. Don't say that when you're in an endless diplomatic shuffle with Abu Mazen and with Netanyahu, don't say that that is simply about trying to resolve that Palestinian issue, or that you're simply about trying to get an outcome in Iran that is important on a non-proliferation objective. Understand this. Asia is deeply bound up in your success in the Middle East. Only you can play those sorts of roles in the Middle East. And what does it mean in Asia? Well, what it means in Asia can be looked at two different levels, cultural and economic. Islam is not dominated by the Middle East. Islam is fundamentally, in population terms, an Asian phenomenon. You can fit the entire Arab world, population terms, into Indonesia and have leftovers. And that's before you look at Pakistan, and before you look at India, and before you look at Bangladesh, and you have the world's most prominent Islamic democracy in Malaysia. Islam is an Asian phenomenon. And they are concerned about what happens in the Middle East. Now, Kurt Campbell used to, from time to time, ask me a question, and I always knew that he was asking the question because he knew the answer, and he was testing whether I was properly catechised. But but on one occasion, he did ask me a question he didn't know the answer to. He said, Kim, when your foreign ministers go through Southeast Asia, do they ask you questions about Palestine? And I said, well, no, they don't. He said, it's the first thing they raise with me as I go through the region. Their opening discussion is always about Palestine. I said, well, they know darn well we can't do much about it, but I think you might be able to. But what was important to them was that those issues were resonating in the minds of Islamic people in the region, and their hopes were, because they had genuine affection for the United States, that the US could do something about it. The second thing, economic. 70% of the customers of Middle East oil are in the Asia Pacific. 10 years' time, that'll be 90, and if the projections for what's happening in global oil and gas production elsewhere, probably in another 15, 20 years' time, Asia will be the only customer of the Middle East. And they who keep the sea lines of communication open between the Persian Gulf and through Asia up to North Asia, they're the ones who keep Asia alive. Those sea lanes are utterly critical for Asian prosperity. There is only one power capable of doing that, and there will only ever be one power capable of doing that. And if that power doesn't do it, then it won't be done. And this is a matter of vast importance to the people in the Asia-Pacific region, and so it is important that Secretary Kerry, who does care about the affairs of the region, at the same time as he has these enormous other burdens, actually develops a linkage in the narrative that is American foreign policy to put those two things together. Now, I've got about 50 other things I'd like to say, but I see that I'm going to really knock question time about quite badly if I do. So I'm just going to finish off, just go back over a little bit the ground that I've been going over to this point, and just say just a few salient things about it. We are valued as an intelligent muse by the United States. It used to be, and it sometimes still is, a conceit that, for example, in terms of relationships with China, that we could somehow or other stand between them and sort of munificently bring them together. That's absurd. It's a silly proposition. The Americans know a lot more about China than we do. They relate to the Chinese across the board far more closely than our people do. They have serious discussions with the Chinese about investment policy and in industrial issues and like. We don't. We sell them minerals and energy. The Americans try to establish companies in China and struggle in a very difficult regulatory environment. They've got a lot of things to say to the Chinese and they know them extremely well. And the Chinese don't need mediation to talk to the Americans. But I'll tell you what the Americans do need. They need somebody who knows something about it to talk to. And the Americans value us enormously as a muse in that area. That is an important element of it. The second thing that is important to it is the integration of our armed services with theirs. We have a very high level of scientific collaboration. Very few armed forces now globally can keep up with the United States. We are at least within fingertip touch with them. Most of that is because we're prepared to pay good, cold, hard cash for the equipment we receive, and we make sure the equipment we receive has absolutely all the bits and pieces on it that we need, not just some of them. And so that's a very important attribute as well. But we also add value. We invent things. And many of the things that we invent end up on American warships or on American warplanes. We are a very creative people when it comes to scientific excellence. The principal passive defence system now of American warships, and Australian for that matter, is a rocket called Nulka. It's a hovering rocket that replicates as it's fired out, it replicates the radar signature of the ship, and therefore, but does it so strongly so the incoming guided missile goes chasing after the rocket rather than chasing after the warship which fired it. An Australian invention. We have a very advanced radar now, Australian invention. The Americans are beginning to pick up. And there's a whole range of highly classified programs which I am often indiscreet about, but not on television cameras and in front of an audience like this one. But we are a very useful partner for the United States on that front. We are useful to the United States economically and getting more so in the manner in which I've been talking about, and the Americans are beginning to realise that. I got so chuffed when Americans are not used to arguing that people ought to invest in the US. The US should be investing in other people, that's what they say, but things have changed. Economic power equation has changed. US now runs investment encouragement, and I was enormously proud when in a speech that Obama made encouraging people to invest in the United States, he mentioned only 4 countries in the course of that speech. One of them was Australia. The stats are starting to show up in the minds of the president's speechwriters. And when you're a statistic in the mind of a presidential speechwriter, you're an exceptionally powerful animal indeed. So thanks very much for coming along, and I think I've got about 20 minutes for questions.
Thank you. The very definition of a tour de force. We have 2 microphones on both sides. I just ask that you keep your questions short so we can get as many as possible in.
What he means by that is keep my answers short.
Indeed. So go ahead, by raise of hand. Yes, over here first.
Hi, Ambassador. My name's Angus Duncan. I'm a student here at UWA. Certainly, you've talked up the US-Australia relationship. But amongst young people, there's this growing negative perception of America, flowing especially from the consequences of Iraq, Afghanistan, the GFC, and partly because of Obama's failure to achieve his legislative goals. Do you think there's any sort of merits to this thinking amongst young people, or are we just a bit ignorant of the realities of the relationship?
No, our young people are very intelligent, but I've got to tell you, the grizzles that you might have about the Americans now are nothing compared with the generation I was a member of. in relation to. I mean, everybody thinks they've invented things anew. This is a very quiet, very affectionately oriented, as far as the United States call is concerned, young people's gathering. The young people of my generation were spitting mad, and that could not be said to describe the situation now. We have a massive interest in the US. You know, I love doing this particular stat, as the Pew Research group did it in the 2008 presidential election. They globally asked a question, are you interested in the US presidential elections? In the United States, they answered that question, 83% said they were. They asked the question in Australia and 84% said they were. We do know a lot about the United States, and that is because we absorb American political culture, social culture, and Philip Adams' rueful expression, like blotters. And far more than was the case when I was a bit younger than you, where the orientation was enormously Anglo. Now, our accents, our social interests, our cultural interests are so heavily American, it just does not bear comparison. We may object to that, but there is that close view. We are so close now, we believe we have the right in detail to micromanage American policy and a right to be critical of things that they're doing. But I have to say this, I have never heard a criticism by a young person or an old person of things that are going on in the United States, from this country, or from Europe, or from the Middle East, that I don't hear day in, day out in the United States. The United States is heavily politically disaggregated. The United States has never been so ideologically divided. The Democratic caucus of the House of Representatives is to the left of the Australian Labor Party federal caucus. The Republican caucus of the House of Representatives is to the right of the Australian Liberal Party. And you can see it in crossover voting. In 1982, of the 430-odd members of the House of Representatives, 347 of those members had a substantial record of collaboration with members of another political party in putting forward a piece of legislation or supporting a piece of legislation in the House of Representatives. Last year, that figure was 11. And of that 11, 9 were Democrats and 2 were Republicans. There is a drift to the right substantially. There are no moderates left in the Republican Party. There's conservatives versus radicals. The difference in the radical component is whereas the successive manifestations of the right in Republican politics since the 1960s has been a sort of a more internationalist hue, the last being neocons during the course of the Iraq War. Now, increasingly, it's isolationist. So there's an intense debate on the US on all the things that you've been talking about here. But it's also a factor, and this is something that really requires a bit of attention. The United States, this is a very circumspect administration. It's a very cautious administration. If you're looking at the past of American, the ideological gamut of American foreign policy, you'd take the approaches to limitations on American power, limitations on the full panoply of intelligence collection or what ought to happen in regard to it, the way in which the Middle East should be engaged. You take a look at all of that, and essentially the administration is within a sort of centrist to centre-left tradition of American foreign policy. Oddly enough, the exception to this, because I want to be short, I'll just simply make the assertion, is the pivot, is in the Far East, East Asia. There the United States is operating classic, older, alliance-building mechanisms, development of international legal principles, assertion of the right character of relationships between states, that is redolent of the way in which the policies operated more in the 1950s, 60s and 70s. And it's an interesting phenomenon, which I'm trying to think my way through the consequences of it now, but a lot of people in other contexts say that the Asia-Pacific region is the last manifestation of the Treaty of Westphalia. That this is the last place where state sovereignty is the be-all and end-all. But they don't want to listen to talks about the cross-border character of global politics now. They don't think like that at all in the Asia-Pacific region, and the US is responding accordingly. So there's much about the American East Asian diplomacy which is simply classical and conservative with a small c, but also very forward-leaning, and it's no accident that the bulk of American armed forces are going to be shifted in that direction. So you're seeing a very different picture emerging now, a very bifurcated picture. But because there is so much up for grabs here, and the old paradigm of the Cold War is gone, every time you see an American administration change, from this point on, you're likely to see quite substantial changes in foreign policy.
Yes, right here, if we could.
David Denemark from Political Science, UWA. Welcome back, Kim.
Yeah, nice to see an old colleague.
You said that Obama is the first post-Cold War president, and one of the things that's changed is the end of the bifurcation of the single enemy and state-based threat. One of the implications is the rise of reliance on intelligence gathering, which has its own politics, as we found here. So Australia linked in with the US and information gathering in places like Indonesia. I was wondering whether you might say something about the politics of information gathering and perhaps fueling some of the discontent and the unease that was mentioned before.
Not a whole hell of a lot, David. Look, I think there is, and I don't want to be drawn into, because the government that employs me and directs me studiously avoids discussion of those sorts of issues. But I can talk about it in terms of generality. The overwhelming focus of Australian and friends' intelligence gathering is on the security of the folk at home. That's the overwhelming focus of it. You can have arguments with bits and pieces of that. But it's not about trying to find out what business is doing what and how we might advantage one mate there. It's not about knowing the personal lives of a person whom the analyst or the collector at that point in time might choose to switch his intervention onto in the material that's coming forward. We are far less ubiquitous intelligence gatherers than other countries on the globe, but that's not new. And admittedly, the KGB had responsibility for border guards back in the Cold War, but when we exited the Cold War, I think the CIA and ancillary intelligence agencies in the United States, I think they employed about 70,000 people. KGB numbers, albeit with the border guards as well, was 1 million. And because we're conscience-driven people, because that's an important thing to be, because we're people who debate seriously through the terms and conditions of our security and whether or not we are stepping the mark or overstepping the mark, and what checks and balances should be placed on us. I'm afraid to tell you that we are just about the only intelligence community conducting that discussion, and those who are far more ubiquitous in their purposes than we are, and just as capable, have no such discussion at all.
Maybe one last question right here in the center. Well, go ahead and wait for the microphone if you would, please. We'll get that into you.
Thanks for being here today, Mr. Beazley. Given the recent failures of the US regulatory system that triggered the GFC are still present, in your opinion, is Australia adequately prepared for a possible future financial crisis arising in the United States?
Well, hopefully the US has learned from the GFC, whatever the character of the current regulatory arrangements, and there's a lot of complaint about that in the US from the Conservative side, saying it's too tight and is impacting excessively on investment. Hopefully, you learn new lessons from every past set of mistakes, and that those lessons are being learnt. And certainly when you look at the way in which the American central banking system operates now, they are very, very cautious about those things. But it's a very big operation and things can go wrong. I remember when I used to be finance minister, I used to be responsible as finance minister for deregulation in Australia. And one of the things which looked a bit ultra-virus, the overall policy, was our banking policy. Because we had this 4 pillars policy, which forbade the 4 major Australian banks effectively buying each other. And I remember going to Keating and saying, look, this is a bit at variance with what you say your policies are. You keep arguing you want Australia to go global. You keep saying that you want to have institutions which are heavily engaged and with the global system overall. Why don't you abandon this position? And Keating's response to me was, now listen, mate, if we allow these people to amalgamate, they'll be more powerful than us. Now, the consequence of his adopting that position was this. Before the global financial crisis, Australia had no banks in the top 100 globally. We now have 4 in the top 20. We are a powerful influence in global finance, and we deserve to be, because we are very good at protecting ourselves. And we take things, a regulatory environment, very seriously. That doesn't obviate mistakes. There are always going to be mistakes in this process, or larceny. It doesn't obviate that either. But we have there are many differences between us and Americans. Americans have immense hopes for a well-informed, massively motivated individual free of fetters to get out there and drive a global economy. We have a different approach, and that is anybody who's out there like that is somebody to be watched. And we're necessarily surrounded. And our approach is right. And and others could learn from it. But one of the things I am not permitted to do as ambassador is to proselytise outside the most immediate of Australia's interest in discussion with the United States. But it doesn't stop you doing a bit of boasting. And there is a lot about us in recent years that you can boast about, and a lot that the United States polity has got to learn from our experience. And the interesting thing is, we are one of the few places on earth they're prepared to hear it from.
Well, please join me in thanking the Ambassador. Thank you, sir.